good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone from around the world. I note that we have quite a few people from not Australia, which is wonderful. First thing to do is a reminder that this session will be recorded. So just to remind you all that the panelists you can see are on screen, and obviously we'll be capturing our videos, but we are in webinar mode today, and that means that the audience will not be captured on video, but any chat messages, obviously, if you select to everyone will be able to see them. And if you ask any questions using the Q&A function, Roller and I will be reading them out, and that will be how things work. So to formally begin, my name's Joanna Tai. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at CRADLE, the Centre for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin University, and one of the co-chairs of this year's CRADLE Symposium, along with Associate Professor Roller Ajawi. So I'm coming to you all from Wurundjeri country in southeast Melbourne, and I would like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of these lands, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I acknowledge elders and thank them for their care of the land, which makes it possible for us to meet and learn today. And I note that sovereignty was never ceded. And since we're gathering virtually from many different traditional lands, I invite you all to acknowledge the country you are occupying in the chat. And I see that many people have done that already, so thank you. So I'm very pleased to be chairing this first opening keynote for our 2021 CRADLE Symposium, where we'll explore the question of what is assessment for inclusion. Over the coming days, we've got a closed symposium with some sessions where colleagues will be engaging in discussions to consider inclusion, equity and access, with the idea of supporting diversity in higher education in the context of assessment. And we hope through this that we'll be advancing both theory and practice. Of course, due to the pandemic, we had to move to this online format, which has led to some benefits, such as being able to host open keynote presentations with speakers from around the world. So I'd therefore like to introduce Dr. Jan McArthur, who is Senior Lecturer in Education and Social Justice in the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University in the UK. She's also a researcher in the ESRC and HEFC funded Centre for Global Higher Education, and is currently working on the international and longitudinal project on graduate experiences of employability and knowledge. Her research focuses on the nature and purposes of higher education and how these relate to practices of teaching, learning and assessment. She has a particular interest in critical theory and has applied the work of several philosophers to higher education, including two recent books, one of which is on assessment for social justice, the topic of her talk today. And she's also the Editor-in-Chief of Arts and Humanities in Higher Education. So please welcome Jan, and remember any questions that you have for her can be posed in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And in the meantime, please chat away using the chat function. So yeah, welcome Jan, and please take it away.
Thank you very much. So I'll just share my screen. Good. Okay. So I assume you can see that okay? Good.
Yep.
So thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak today. I was really delighted to receive it, not least because I'm Melbourne born and bred, though you see me here with the Scottish heather behind me. But I hope one day to be able to come and say hi to everyone in CRADLE in person. As some of you will see that the heading for my talk has changed from the abstract, and that reflects a thinking through of the issues for me. So when I first read the really thought-provoking and wonderful think piece from CRADLE colleagues, my first thought was that I wanted to push back on a couple of things, and particularly this issue of philosophical or practical approaches. And I still stand by that, and I'm going to do a little bit of that. But actually, the idea of pushing back isn't really a very positive place to end up. So I think I've now gone beyond that and are thinking, okay, I do think it's important that these are different concepts, but how can we look for the synergies? And I've very much, I should say that the other thing I thought of initially was, Why assessment for inclusion instead of assessment for social justice? And I may be wrong here, and forgive me if I am, but I did think it was probably easier to get all the CRADLE colleagues to come under the umbrella of assessment for inclusion rather than this slightly way out assessment for social justice. But we shall see. But inspired by Rowena Murray, who says that joining a research community is like joining a river, which has flowed before us and will flow after us. And this here is actually the river in my village here in Scotland. So I see assessment for inclusion and assessment for social justice as being part of the same conversation, and that we share the same ideals and ambitions for higher education. And yet it's okay to, and it's actually appropriate to see these as slightly different concepts, but to then look for the synergies between them. So I want to share two anecdotes now to explain this idea of why sometimes compromise is not a good thing, why sometimes we can gain more by recognising two distinct bodies of work and then looking for the synergies. Now, in my first anecdote, I'm about to alienate about 90% of the Australians watching. So there you go. I'm a Collingwood supporter. I'm born and bred. I'm third generation. We like to say my grandfather got off the boat from Scotland and went straight to Victoria Park. So I'm one of those families. For those of you who don't know what this is, Collingwood is the greatest ever football club in the history of Aussie rules, and yet most Australians somehow don't realise that. But the point about being a Collingwood supporter is that you're not a Carlton supporter. There's no wishy-washy, well, I sort of like them a bit, but I sort of like them a bit. The whole idea is that you totally embrace one or the other, and that to have some nice compromise such as this would be an abomination. And in assessment, we know this same abomination of the wrong sort of compromise. We have the scenario with markers where we have the first marker 50%, the second marker says 70%. So I don't know, wouldn't it be collegial to just compromise and come to the middle ground? Well, actually, that is an abomination because it means both markers have abandoned the marking criteria. So every so often, sometimes it's good to see things as not as merged together or find some middle ground. And so my second example starts with a colleague coming to me to say, I'm really worried, Jan. I've got a piece of work from a student and I don't think they wrote it, or I don't think they wrote it all. It's full of inconsistencies. It goes from the general to the specific and so on. Now, some of you may know that I've written about trust and assessment, and you may therefore think that my response to this is to say, oh, well, look, make him a cup of tea. Tell her it's okay. It's not this academic integrity. It's a bit, we make too much of a fuss about it. You know, just make sure the student feels okay. Maybe give her a bit of a cuddle. Now, I very much hope you know that that is exactly not what I did. What I did was I said to my colleague, you need Philip Dawson. You need his work to help identify contract cheating. And in fact, that's what we did. We worked through it. And it was such a textbook case of contract cheating, it could indeed have been written by Philip Dawson as an example. But I use this to say that when I talk about trust and Philip Dawson talks about the need to stop cheating, these are two different conversations. And the outcome isn't to say, well, let's take a little bit of each. So, well, Jan says trust, he says you must catch cheats. So I'll trust for the first 3 pages and then I'll come in hard. That would do a disservice to both of our pieces of work, because even though we share this commitment to academic integrity, to assessment and to higher education, we're talking about two different phenomena. So what I want to say today is that how can we understand assessment for social justice and assessment for inclusion as legitimately different things, but look for those synergies. So I want to begin by a little bit of a reflection on assessment for social justice, I'm just going to skim the surface, so forgive me for those who are unfamiliar with the work. But the original article that I wrote on this was largely a critique of procedural approaches to fairness in assessment. The very Rawlsian idea that if we have fair process, we can be sure that we've got fair outcome. In addition, I argue that there's a lot of unexplored potential in the concept of assessment for learning, that we now have this robust evidence of how assessment supports learning. And if that's the case, and if we have a commitment to social justice, then we could be doing more to harness assessment for social justice. To do this, I argue we need a robust and workable concept of social justice, and we have to be thinking about social justice for all. It's not just about fairness for students. It's about the assessors, the just working conditions of assessing in higher education. It's about professional service staff. It's about the patients and clients these students will go on to engage with, and it's about society as a whole. And the idea is really to open up a new conversation about assessment and the purposes of higher education. And therefore, based in critical theory, particularly first generation, Horkheimer and Adorno, second generation, Honneth and Nancy Fraser, I argue that as I conceive social justice as mutual recognition, and that to live justly is to live our lives as both autonomous individuals and members of society. And it's that twin notion of autonomy and cooperation and membership, which is crucial to critical theory and crucial to my work. And that individual and social well-being, are mutually embedded. I can only see part of my screen. So on this basis, I then want to say what assessment for social justice isn't. It isn't meant to be a last word. It isn't meant to require that you adhere to my concept of social justice, or that it mandates that everyone must be a critical theorist, or that the 5 general understandings through which I explore assessment for social justice, trust, honesty, responsibility, forgiveness, and responsiveness. That's not a definitive list. What I aim to do is to say, if you had this conception of social justice, how would you work through the ways we need to rethink assessment? So it's an example of a working through, not a last word. It's also, I will strongly defend the idea that it's naive. It is aspirational, but it's not naive. And it's also not faultless. So let me turn to that now. One of the great faults looking back on that book, and my Achilles heel, is actually my own Frankfurt School critical theory perspective. And Edward Said, some years ago, said of the Frankfurt School, despite its seminal insights into relationships between domination, modern society, and the opportunities for redemption through arts as critique, they are stunningly silent on racist theory, anti-imperialist resistance, and oppositional practice in the empire. So earlier this year, I felt I had to address this, and I published this article, Critical Theory in a De-Colonial Age. And I felt that we have to openly acknowledge that the neglect of race and colonialism by Horkheimer and Adorno was deliberate, that this is unacceptable. I propose, though, that critical theory still has purpose and use, particularly for non-Indigenous scholars, and that we can, in the words of Denson and Lincoln, be fellow travellers. It's important to be fellow travellers and not look for commensurability, as Tuck and Yang argue, that if we just had some compromise between Indigenous and non-Indigenous thought, or a muddling together, we would have the inevitable Western appropriation or domination, But I do believe there is a shared commitment to social justice, and that particularly for non-Indigenous scholars, mindful not to appropriate other forms of knowing, that critical theory offers a useful perspective. but we must acknowledge its shortfalls. The other thing that's changed since the original book, and Jo mentioned this, is that I am part of the, was part of the Understanding Knowledge in Curriculum and Student Agency project as part of the Centre for Global Higher Education, directed by Simon Marginson. You see there my fellow project team. This was a longitudinal and comparative 4-year study of chemistry and chemical engineering undergraduates in England, the US and South Africa. We interviewed 209 in the first year, and of the students, and of those we then selected 119 to follow through the next 3 years. We're now in the second phase, the one that Jo mentioned, and we'll be following these students for a further 4 years. So at the end, we will have 8 years of longitudinal data and comparative data. So it's very, very exciting to be part of. Now, as a way of working through the enormous amount of data we have, we organised into subgroups according to different themes of interest. So originally we had knowledge, study practices, personal projects, society. We've since added curriculum, and I'm just now beginning a new theme, particularly devoted to assessment. But as part of the society theme, we were able to test out whether we would find evidence of what assessment for social justice suggests should happen. So is assessment contributing to students developing individual and social well-being, mindful that the two interrelate, and for them to have individual well-being, there must be a sense of social well-being. So in a paper that was published earlier this year, myself and colleagues, we reported on our analysis where we generated 3 orientations to consider the way in which students spoke about assessment. Now, these didn't come from the data. These came from the idea of assessment for social justice and critical theory. And we looked to see whether when students talked about assessment, they had an orientation to self, an orientation to discipline, or an orientation to society. And we analysed 427 interviews. So that was the first 3 years in England and South Africa and the first 2 in the US. So what did we find? So orientations to society, 21. So yeah, disappointing, but I would say not unexpected, but this is useful as a way to see the scale of the change that I believe we need to see in assessment. But let me just explain the first 2 orientations by way of context. So here's Raffia. When I was in high school, I used to think that the purpose of an assessment was just to show the teachers that you can do it. Look, I'll get this mark. Since I've come to university, I've seen that it's about making the knowledge stronger in your head for future years. So that's a first year. He could be our ambassador for assessment for learning. And I use this quote to demonstrate that an orientation to self is not about sort of self-absorption. It's a perfectly legitimate orientation, but on its own, from a critical theory perspective, it's not sufficient, at least in the long run. So then we see here in second year, where with Leo, in third year with Leo, he's talking about a design project, and we now have an orientation to discipline or profession. I think the design project is probably going to be the most useful. I do think you'd learn from challenging yourself. I think the design project is the most close to what life is going to be like in the future. Actually, in the field, you'll be working with teams trying to design something. So on to orientations to society. Not only were there only 21, but these were fleeting and tangential. But there was a little cluster at Symposium University, chemical engineering students in South Africa. And at the time these students did the project they're talking about, there was a severe drought. And so the project was built around looking for water, for solutions to the water shortage. And of course, there's clear social justice issues here, and there's intersections of race and wealth with water poverty. So Nathi here expresses this well. I think they are trying to develop us to be holistic learners. And I think the projects also are to keep us engaged about what is going on around us and how we can impact people in the community and provide solutions and change the situation in that regard. So this is a beautiful demonstration of an orientation to society, as we would expect to see it in third year, where they're starting to do more independent project work. But the question remains is, why were there so many other students who talked about the same project and knew it was about water shortage who didn't make these connections? So that's one of the takeaways from this, that just having a topic that has a social justice resonance is not in itself necessarily enough to nurture an orientation to society. However, on a cheerier note, here's Scarlett, chemistry student from Symposium University in first year. Now, Scarlett's transcript is a joy to read. It is full of, I want to change the world. So here's 3 examples. I have always wanted to help people and try and save lives. If I want to go into research and if I want to change the world, if I want to change a problem in South Africa, I will have to study and get my degree and go further on. And then here she's referring to a very specific problem, which I've taken out. So I have seen the suffering of that, and I would like to investigate and see if there is something that I could do. So here Scarlett comes into university with this strong orientation to society, which is just joyful to read. Where's Scarlett by third year? I want to be able to walk out of here as a chemistry student that companies would like to hire. Now, there's nothing wrong with what Scarlett says in third year. It's a perfectly legitimate ambition. But surely there's a sense here of something lost. Surely there's a sense here that a student could come into university full of this passion and commitment to the wider social world, and it goes over time. So clearly, the aspiration of assessment for social justice and its realisation, there's something of a gulf between them, which again is not unexpected, but it's helpful to understand what that might mean. And one way perhaps of breaching that gulf would be the idea of assessment for social justice and assessment for inclusion sort of coming together in that watery space between aspiration and realisation. And as was suggested in the original think piece, assessment for social justice brings the philosophical dimension and assessment for inclusion brings more practical dimension. Well, this is where I'm going to push back a little bit and say that I don't think that's the right way to think about it. For me, there's too much of a binary between theory and practice in that way of understanding it. And influenced as I am by Theodore Adorno, for all his faults, I strongly believe the idea that practice without thought can be tyranny, and that thought is an immensely practical act. So where does that leave us? Well, I think rather than the watery space there where we just sort of merge together, I like the idea of a rock pool where at times you know you're on the rock and at times you know you're in the water. You know that you're engaging sometimes with assessment for social justice, and you know you're engaging with assessment and inclusion, and sometimes you're half in and half out. But the main thing is that these are different, but together they form this rich ecosystem where the starfish, nobly acting as to represent our students, can flourish. So coming together in an ecosystem where we can still be different, but helpful to each other. And I won't go through all of these, but when I read through all of the papers for the symposium, and I read through looking to think, how would these relate to my work? I found a connection from every single one of them. From where I talk about trust being beyond technocratic relationships, when Phil Dawson talks about assessment for inclusion and the importance of having secure assessment methods, we actually are talking in not completely in different ways. And same, I see resonance in the idea of honesty in these papers, responsibility as a right, forgiveness and responsiveness. So I won't go into them, but I just wanted to say, for me, I see the synergies emerging quite clearly. And for me, that's really exciting. And I've learned a lot reading the work of these colleagues. But I do want to talk about two points of not warning, but two things I think we need to be very careful of. And one is the idea that theory or philosophy can ever become optional. So why does it matter how we conceptualize things? And I realize that not everybody has as much fun as I do playing around with concepts. And surely what's important in our ecosystem is that some of us do some things and others do others. So it's not that we all have to be doing the same. But I want to touch on why it does matter to think through how we conceptualize ideas. And the philosopher Raymond Gess, drawing on the work of Nietzsche, shows us how Nietzsche conceptualized this, that a triangle is an inanimate object, so it has no history, so we can define it precisely. A triangle is something with three sides. The concept of democracy is a human concept. It's got a history, so we can't fix one simple, easy definition. Because what we mean by democracy today, which is generally positive, 400 years ago, this term meant something quite tyrannical to people. So because once we're in the human world, we're in a historical world, and so meaning is very hard to tie into fixed, easy, snappy definitions. And clearly Adorno, influenced by Nietzsche, took this further with his work on negative dialectics, which you're probably pleased I'm not going to go too far into today. But I will say that the key message is that when we attempt to tie meaning down to fixed definitions, we often destroy that which we seek to understand. Knowledge is neither absolute nor relativist, but it is historical and contextual. So Adorno gives two examples of this. The colour red. How do you define the colour red? He says you can't. Now, I know there's probably some clever person out there saying, well, actually, you can define it by a certain point on the wavelength. But even that still wouldn't tell me what red meant, would it? You would have to give examples and suggestions and try and evoke red. A less prosaic example comes with Adorno from the idea of freedom. Now, freedom matters as something we understand, but we will not understand it better through tying it down to a tight definition. Instead, we can know freedom. This is one of many examples. If someone being free means that if somebody rings the bell at 6:30 a.m., I have no reason to think that the Gestapo or the GPU or the agents of comparable institutions are at the door and can take me off without my right of being able to invoke habeas corpus. So we can demonstrate freedom, we can evoke it, and that's much more useful than tying it down to a definition. And why does this matter? Well, it matters to me with a commitment to social justice and inclusion because we're always battling an inherently conservative society. And even in a neoliberal world, and not to over-egg the extent of neoliberalism, but the irony there is that much as it talks about change and innovation, it's change to ensure the status quo. So the pressures not to change are great. And one of the great ways they do that is by taking concepts, take sustainability, for example, take a concept and empty of meaning by including it in all the mission statements of companies that are spewing out greenhouse gases. So it's an important concept, sustainability, but it's also been co-opted and emptied of its meaning. And the other way it can be done is by closing down conversations. And this happens quite a lot to me with reviewers who say, well, social justice could mean anything to anybody. So really, what's the point talking about it? And the same potentially could happen with inclusion. So this closing down discussion, because we cannot give neat and precise definitions is something that we have to resist. And for me to outline my conception of social justice is not to dictate that that is the conception for all, but it simply gives transparency to my argument. You can see, okay, those are the conclusions she's come to based on that understanding. And then that enables a dialogue, and a dialogue between different conceptions of something like social justice. And then maybe we can move beyond the status quo. So do we avoid these complications if we focus on inclusion rather than social justice? And I would say, no, we don't. Just the same problems are there. So we have already a lot of work on inclusion in higher education, particularly focusing on disability, non-traditional students, and widening access. And these are all immensely positive things. However, they all also run the danger of becoming procedural. So we're going through the motions, of being conservative. So why do we make a few adjustments for students that we pick out as being different? We make those adjustments so we can preserve the university as it is and not have to challenge the foundations of really, should we think of something more genuinely inclusive from the ground up? And for me, practical change, real change, requires thinking through the concept. Now, by some amazing coincidence, earlier this year, I took my critical theory lens to the concept of inclusion. And before I talk about that, this article is very much structured around the debate between Fraser and Honneth, which features in this book here on the right. And I just want to note this book as a beautiful example of what I mean by the productive power of not compromising. So Fraser and Honneth each set out their argument, and each one gives a rejoinder to the other one, and then there's a rejoinder to the rejoinder. They hold their ground, but they're respectful and they're kindly, but they have different views and they share them openly. And that to me is one of the best symbols, that book, of what academic debate should be. But anyway, moving back to the idea of inclusion, what I argue in this article is that inclusion within the university needs to shift from being about categories of people to become the full realisation of everyone within the university as both individual and social beings. And so I draw on Honneth in part, and then I draw on Fraser, and particularly her notion of affirmative or transformative change. Affirmative change is change that you make that doesn't affect the underlying status quo. So we have an economic system of winners and losers. We want to preserve that, but maybe we'll bring in a welfare state to ameliorate some of the negative effects on some of the so-called losers. Transformative change is we look, what are the causes of a system in which there are winners and losers? And the reason I didn't mention this earlier from the CRADLE Symposium is coincidentally, these colleagues have reached very much the same point, using Fraser's critical theory to make an argument that what we need for inclusion is truly transformative change rather than simply adjustments. So my second and final point is that we've got to focus on movement between ideas and not on a binary. So just for a moment, imagine, okay, maybe it is fairly fair to say assessment for social justice is quite general, and then it moves to a few practical examples. And it is definitely aspirational, and it is definitely a transformative commitment. Assessment for inclusion perhaps is looking at specific groups and specific issues, and has looking more at some very immediate problems that do need addressing now. And it could be affirmative or transformative. But you see, those differences to me are not what's really helpful here. What's really helpful is that a research community, we move between these. We move between focusing on immediate problems and looking at the more general, and the other way around. And again, it's not that everyone does everything, but that this working together through these different levels and these different orientations and perspectives is what will really make for a rich assessment community. And so, if I may say, what we have here is that while some of us may be looking down the telescope at something very, very close up, maybe it's quite good that some of us are standing back and taking a bigger view and we see the bear that's coming. And vice versa. If I'm only ever looking at the bear, I'm never seeing the beautiful things close up around me. So I began with this idea of us being in a river together, but I've changed my metaphor. I've moved on. I now like the idea of a rock pool more, because we still have the flow and the tide, but what we have here is an ecosystem where it's perfectly legitimate to sit on the rock and it's perfectly legitimate to be in the water, but it's how these work together that ensure the richness. So I want to end, and my apologies to Philip Dawson, I don't know you enough to be using you so much in this talk, but I'm referring to your work because I think it demonstrates how two approaches that seem to be so different, you worrying about cheating, me worrying about trust, actually can have strong synergies. So here's a couple of examples. So in his fabulous book, Philip, sorry, I'm just trying to see my screen, talks of a failure to focus on assessment security has led to the accreditation of an unknown number of incompetent professionals who have feigned competence through cheating. These doctors, teachers, lawyers, engineers, academics, journalists, and accountants walk among us. Oh, gosh, that was scary. Accountants are walking among us. Now, I agree with everything there. And that is a really great example of how we focus on a particular issue. But I would also say that when I focus on honesty and forgiveness, I'm addressing the same thing. Because if we're not honest about our assessment practices, say if we go back to final school assessment practices, where here in the UK at least, these are still very much norm referenced. I don't care what the exam boards say, they are norm referenced. And this year, for example, before these poor students even sat down and wrote a single word, the exam board came out and said, we're going to cap the number of A's we give. The students aren't doing the work for another 9 months, but they've already decided who's going to get what marks. Now, while we have assessment systems like that, and we are not honest about them and challenging them, the people who go in to medical school or law school may not be the ones who really are going to be the best professionals to be walking amongst us. So before we even go down the cheating route, we've still got a problem if we don't honestly confront other issues about assessment. And the same with forgiveness. If we don't have an assessment system that allows for the fact that not everybody is a traditional student with a traditional background, we may end up with the doctors, teachers, and lawyers who are just part of the normal group of winners and not at all the people who can best represent and support and nurture our society. Second example, some within academic integrity view a focus on assessment security as anathema to their positive mission. I've heard the problem of cheating blamed on neoliberalism, assessment design, poor teaching, distrust, non-traditional students, international students, credentialism, online learning, and a host of other factors. Now, you may think, well, yeah, that's Jan there saying it's all about distrust. I'm not saying cheating occurs because of distrust. I'm saying that distrust may not be on its own the way to fix cheating. But what I see in what Philip Dawson is saying there is a beautiful example of what I call radical pessimism, because he's saying this is hard to fix, and let's not go down some route of thinking there's an easy solution here of just being nice. There isn't. The sort of change that we're talking about in assessment for social justice is hard change. And to get there, we have to be radically pessimistic and understand that the way forward is difficult. And this is why I say it's not a naive position. And just to end, he also talks about approaches that could help design cheating out. So having positive messages, having discussions with students about why using essay mills is such a bad idea. And perhaps rather than having a list of banned activities, let's have a list of activities we allow. Again, I think these are brilliant ideas and I would fully support them. But at the risk of abusing the privilege of the keynote, if I may have the last word, I don't think we can have either of these unless we also have, in some form, trust. So I look forward to meeting you all in the rock pool, and I hope that we can find these synergies and work together for what I think are two both really important causes for higher education. So I will stop sharing there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jan. A round of virtual applause. Many things for us to think about, and the chat has been going off with a lot of comments, but relatively few questions so far, and I wonder if that's because people are still taking a moment or two to collect their ideas and figure out what the most important things to question you on are. However, we do have a couple so far, and I'll go with the one that feels like it's related to radical pessimism, which is the thought that's most in my mind at the moment. And Margaret Bierman asks, we know that assessment change is hard at scale. Any thoughts on how we transform at scale?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I wish I had a really good answer coming quickly to mind. I suppose what I think is that to do it at scale, we have to do this on several fronts. Now, I know normally, and I'm sorry, this is a very militaristic metaphor, but I know normally it's not a good idea to approach on different fronts. But I think we have to, one of the reasons we don't get through to scale is because of this, what I talk about is the taming and domestication of ideas as we bring them in. We don't see them through because I think sometimes we don't fully explain to colleagues exactly what is the implications of them. So take, for example, something like constructive alignment. A beautifully radical concept when John Biggs came up with it, challenging people in terms of how they think about their students and how they think about assessment. But it's used today, but I often see it used today in a really tamed way. It's on a PG cap and you're told, just make sure when you're designing the course that it's blump, 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 they're all in a neat line. That's such a tamed version of constructive alignment. So I think when we introduce change, we have to introduce change in a way that we explain it. But I also think the other real thing when it comes to change at scale is we have to work through the curriculum and redesign the curriculum, because we can talk all we want and research all we want about formative feedback, for example, but there isn't the space for this to be done well in the way most curricula are currently organised. So I think we need this holistic view of curriculum reform and really think through what assessment for learning means in terms of challenging that idea that it's still the bit stuck on the end.
Yeah, a constant struggle. I'm just trying to, okay, how about we follow that one with a question from Molly. So she's following on from that idea around scale and the idea of trust. So how do we go about building trust at scale? And I think this is really, thinking about our situation in Australia with large classes. For instance, at Deakin, we've got over 1,000 students in some units each run of the unit. So how do we go about building trust at that level?
So I've never done it with 1,000 students, but I've done it with several hundred. And I think trust is a relational concept. That's why I use it. So it's about the relationship that you have with your students. And it's about personalization. And we know in terms of effective feedback how important personalization is. So even in a large class, what I always, and I don't teach large undergraduates now, but when I did, it was my philosophy to make sure that every single one of those several hundred students felt that they could knock on my door and have a chat. and then to hope like hell that they all don't, because obviously I couldn't go if they did. But to create an atmosphere where they feel that I'm someone who they can trust and that I have trust in them and that we have a respectful relationship. For me, the tiny bit of time it takes to do that takes away so many problems. And I often have colleagues say, well, I don't have the time to do that. But 10 minutes spent with a student here will save you 3 hours later or several days of paperwork when they make an appeal against you. So I think to do it at scale is about how we present ourselves, but it is also about how we communicate expectations. And this is why I am critical of certain approaches to plagiarism, because I think that we create an atmosphere where students are so busy fleeing plagiarism that becomes a proxy for good academic practice. And so I think this is why there can be trust, but it doesn't have to be naive. And breaches of trust have consequences, and we should be open about that. So it's sort of that balancing. But I think if we front load everything with, we start our undergraduates off with these long lectures about plagiarism and we scare the bejeepies out of them, don't we? And you see that in students. I'm so scared I'm going to plagiarize by accident that they cannot. And then we say to them, but we want your own voice. We want criticality. We want originality. So I think it's a relational issue and that you can do that at scale. It does, though, as in my example of everyone can knock on my door, but please don't. There is a little bit of a sleight of hand. That's the only way to manage things at scale. But at the same time, it is sort of genuine. If I did find that I had 300 students who did all want to knock on my door, I would then find some other way. I would hold a lecture, a town hall, if you like. There would be a problem there that I would have to address, so I wouldn't ignore it. And I think that's the other thing about creating trust with students, is that they know that you will respond. And Ira Shaw, the great critical pedagogy writer, it's not about responding in terms of always giving them what they want, but it's responding in terms of saying, I am going to better explain to you why I'm suggesting you read this or do that. But sometimes it is about changing. Us being able to say, you know what, students, I got that one wrong. Let's forget that. That's a daft reading. Let's do this instead.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it kind of suggests, the things that students learn from being within the university system, and how they respond to us as well. And I think there are a couple of people who are really interested in Scarlett's sort of trajectory and change from being someone who's optimistic and wanting to help in the world to someone who is quite focused on what she's going to do after university. And I think two of the questions, so Kate and Stefan both wondered about what was happening there. And Stefan says, student agency is interesting. I'm wondering if Scarlett's comments are, at least in part, a recognition of the fact that working for a company is one of the dominant ways in which an individual can contribute to society in positive or negative ways. So learning about the world, I suppose, as well. Did you get a sense of that sort of in the interviews?
No, I wish I did. I've thought around different ways of explaining Scarlett, because it is such a stark example. And this is what's wonderful about qualitative research, isn't it? Because of course, yes, it's one student, but my goodness, what we can learn from this one student. My worry with the idea of thinking that, so on the one hand, it's not for me to tell Scarlett that in third year she shouldn't be thinking about getting a job in a company. But what worries me is the fact that there's no evidence anywhere in the transcripts that she associates this in any way with any other purpose. It's become an end in itself. So she's not saying, oh, I want to be someone a company will employ because I came to university with these ambitions to save the world, and that's how I'm going to do it. it's all gone. It's completely disappeared. There's shadows of it in her second year transcript, and it's completely disappeared in her third. And that to me is that to me is the really worrying thing.
Yeah, and I think Margaret earlier made a comment that it's very similar to what we've found in medical education around students losing empathy for patients as they progress through their clinical years, and it's we don't have an answer for what to do about that either.
Can I, if I interrupt, just on Scarlett, I'm going to raise Yuso's question, although it's not at the top, but it's related to Scarlett. And Yuso's asking, well, he's making the point around assessment and grading of individual students and whether that's part of the issue here. And the question is around what needs to change for assessment to address interdependence and communality rather than individualism. So what can we do in terms of higher education that brings forth an orientation to society?
Yes, I think we're sending a lot of mixed messages to students, because we talk about authentic assessment, we talk about criticality, but then we talk about, well, make sure you don't collude, So, and you see, particularly in the engineering students, this comes through all the time. The thing that we're going to be doing when we go out, the whole point of being an engineer is that as I understand it, engineers never work alone. You can maybe have an architect who sits in a turret and does brilliant plans all on their own, but an engineer by their very nature is someone working with others. And I think we are still struggling to understand how we do that with integrity in our assessment systems, because we get students worried about collusion, and then I think we still haven't worked out a just and fair and inclusive way of group work. And yet at the same time, there is, if we go back to the idea of academic integrity, at the end, we are also at some point certificating an individual to be a professional with competence. So there's tensions there between that. But I think in the case of Scarlett, how do we develop this social orientation? For some reason, again, we have this inconsistent dialogue of, we want to talk about authentic and this awful phrase that I hate, the real world, and yet we put students in something and we sort of say, but this is going to be different, and we're going to have all these rules and regulations that you'll never again have in your life, and these are going to completely shape what you do, and we're going to sit you in an exam room without any books at all, and they'll be doing that because that's rigorous. And it's just, there's so many mixed messages that I think it's really hard. But with someone like Scarlett, I just wish, and look, maybe I might be wrong on this, but I've spoken to someone at Charlotte's institution, and her view is that nobody's talking about these things, that Scarlett comes in and this is how she wants to talk, and she's socialized at university, that's not academic, that's it's silly, frivolous, naive, and that what she should be doing is just getting down and being a tough chemist. And I think we have to look at the way we're socializing students. And for me, the worst thing about higher education is when we see it does harm, that students come in and they leave with less passion than they came in. And Richardson wrote a great paper about this years ago, a student called Pauline at Monash University studying economics. And I studied economics at Monash, so it resonated. She comes in as a student excited about the world. Assessment teaches her to park that excitement.
Thanks. I'm processing the questions, and I think we have three that are kind of around the same ideas around definitions, or what terms would be useful and popular. So Chair says, whenever I think about inclusion or social justice. Diversity is another thing that comes to mind. Geraldine O'Neill points out that social justice is a term for many can be seen as language used by particular disciplines in an institution, i.e. social and humanities. And perhaps is there a term that might be familiar for all disciplines, including the sciences? And is that why inclusion is more popular? And of course, Dave Bowd also talks about the same kind of thing. I think CRADLE team, our aspiration in using inclusion was that it could be taken up perhaps a little bit more universally. But the compromise in assessment for inclusion is perhaps it doesn't expect to change the whole institution, because if it was thought to do this, it would be rejected. So here are a couple of different sort of thoughts around, well, what words could we be using, and how can we tackle this synergistically, I suppose? Like, could we use different terms for different people, perhaps?
I'm going to say no, but it's not, for me, it's not the term. It's the concept that the term represents. So I take it, was it Geraldine who said that social justice could be seen as a term of a very particular way of thinking. So I think that's a really good point. But the point is to think, how do we say this is universal? Because, of course, I have this a lot in my work, and people will say, well, Jan, that's all very well if you're working with the sociologists, they'll understand it, but you can't take these ideas to the physicists and the chemists. But actually, if you look at our project, there's a few HE generalists like myself and Paul Ashwin, but nearly everyone else are engineers and chemists. So we are... The idea that is barren territory for social justice is untrue. And actually, I did a small piece years ago on critical pedagogy and what disciplines use it. And, the one that came out, had the most publications on critical pedagogy? Accounting. Can you believe it? I know. It's just, so I think we have to be really careful that we don't make assumptions about disciplines. And I think the reason I like using critical theory is because I think it's talking about individuals and society, and nothing about that doesn't relate to any individual discipline. It may relate differently. So, but at the same time, I get the point that was made. If we was to go and tell everyone that the CRADLE project is to change the world and dismantle the structures of power in higher education, no one would listen. But then maybe that's why you need someone like me on the edge who is saying it. And most people aren't listening, but maybe some are. And maybe that helps. That's what I mean by the synergies of. So I still think it's practical to be saying these things that are unthinkable and uncomfortable. So I was at, recent meeting with very senior managers. They were talking about how to reform assessment. And I said, the problem is there's no longer any joy. And goodness, you should have seen the look they gave me. I said, there's no room for joy. When an academic sits down to mark a pile of 300 scripts, that in a certain turnaround, they can find no joy in their students' achievements because they're not given time. And he looked like I was the weirdest thing on earth. But for me, that was a practical act of just putting a little idea out there that let's stop thinking about all these regulations and rules and what you're going to instruct people to do. And let's look at it from the other end of what assessment really should be. And for academics, it should be a joyous celebration of student achievement.
Beautiful. There are a couple more questions. I know it's just 6:01. We are scheduled to run for another 15 minutes, so I think we're able to get through a few more questions. There's one from, now my window's going all weird. There was one from Brett Stevenson who said, I was interested to hear Jan mention the importance of inclusion of and for academic staff in assessment as well. So I'd like to ask Jan to speak more to the inclusion of academic staff and teachers in the assessment process. Automated marking and feedback via artificial intelligence represents the holy grail for EdTech. Ooh, I'm not sure if all of the EdTech people would agree with that. But anyway, what do you think teachers have to lose in the move to automated marking and assessment?
Joy.
Yeah.
I'll start where I sort of left off. Automate. Look, I'm not saying that there aren't certain things, and particularly where we have the building blocks of knowledge, so say in chemistry, there's a time in first year where they're learning the chemical elements, and that might be something that could be done in that way. But I would still say that we have a lot to lose, because we go back to the earlier point that what we need to be doing is building relationships. And so I think we send a really strange message that completely counteracts what we've spent 2 decades or more doing about assessment. If we say this can just be done through some automated process, then how does that match with what we've been trying to convince the world about assessment for learning? It seems wrong to me. But I think that one of the things that we need to think about is, again, coming back to, so when teachers need to be involved in how they assess students, because otherwise, how do they teach them to do those assessments? So here in the UK, there's been a lot of debate over this, and I've written several pieces on it, where because of the pandemic, we've had teacher assessed grades for Highers and A-levels. And there's been all sorts of controversy, and there's been the whole moral panic of grade inflation. But actually, the idea that a teacher can teach students and never have any experience of what it is to assess them is incredibly worrying to me, because surely we're going back to the old days of assessment as the bit stuck on the end. And so I think it's a worrying trend. I can see why it might fit in certain sort of simple situations, building blocks of knowledge, but I don't think that's the way to think around scale. I think that's letting scale do the thinking for us. And we need to go back and find another way and think creatively around this. And I know I sound like I'm really anti-tech a lot of the time, but it worries me that universities, I could go to a university manager and say I needed this big pot of money for a new tech solution, and I'd get it. If I went and said, I need this big pot of money so we can have 5 people to really nurture good student writing, I wouldn't get it. And that to me is a problem.
Yes. Yuso says in the chat, shall we start by getting rid of grades? And I was going to say before, maybe Cradle does have some radical sort of projects and aims. We just try to keep them on the down low and by stealth get everyone involved. Okay, there are a couple more questions. The first takes us back a little bit to the critical theory side. And would you mind explaining your take of the limitations around critical theory?
What I was, so I particularly use first generation and third generation. I don't have a lot of time for Habermas anymore, I'm afraid. He's too much trying to make the world perfect for my liking. But Habermas is a good example, though, of the problem I was trying to say, is that he's quite openly said in the past that he has no interest in colonialism. And yet his work is all based on a critique of late capitalism. Where does he think capitalism came from? What's it based on, if not colonialism? I mean, it just makes no sense. And so I think this is a real flaw. And it was, for me, very painful to go back and address the fact that looking at different influences, Adorno and Horkheimer, it's not just that they were of a time where people weren't making connections to race. That's just not what was happening. There was a deliberate failure to engage. So it has a very Eurocentric, and it's the worst thing. It's the Western thought assumed as though it's universal. And if it's not true for everyone, well, it should be true for everyone. So I think that is a real problem. At the same time, I do think we can rescue from it some things that, particularly as a resource for non-Indigenous scholars to think about the world differently, it is one of the best frameworks for saying, how do we find moments to go outside the status quo, to do that imagining otherwise? And if we never imagine otherwise, we will never have real change.
Yes, I think that the how do we get to the change? What are the paths that we can take? And the many paths I think we can take to achieving that is probably going to be something that we're going to be discussing for the next few days. So perhaps a last question, again from Margaret. If thoughtfulness is a key part of the approach, what would you recommend as a first step towards assessment for social justice? For us plebs out here who are less familiar with all of it.
A first step. I think it comes down to this idea for me, and this again is my approach, and there are others, is that we recognise that when we think about our students, when we think about ourselves as academics, we think about our professional services colleagues, we don't flourish as human beings by being autonomous individuals alone. We flourish through the fact that we learn with others and we learn to do things that contribute to others. And it doesn't mean practical. It could be your social contribution is that you play the recorder beautifully and you give joy to others. You know, that's a part of being human, that part of contributing to others as well as developing yourself. And so for me, that was a starting point. And from there, everything else I do are just ways of exploring how that could come into assessment. But I do think that starting with the idea of having that lofty ambition, that assessment can be not just for learning, but it could be for nurturing full, flourishing human beings. And I know that sounds really profound. And I know you think, well, how can a maths test do that? But I just think sometimes we need those aspirations. And for me, what drives my work is moving between these aspirations and then how would I see that in an everyday example of walking into a class to teach Economics 101. And it's a thinking through. So it's not an answer that I'm really offering. I'm trying to offer a way of thinking through.
Thanks. So a little bit more hope for all of us in what we do, aspirations in our everyday practice, rather than thinking it's this big project that we haven't quite got time for. I think that's all the questions, and I think the chat has quieted down, so it's probably time that we wrap up. So thank you very much, Jan, for all your thoughtful contributions today. It's been wonderful to hear more about your work and how thinking through the ways in which we can have synergies. I'd like to invite everyone to keep on having this conversation. We've got another keynote on Monday from Penny Burke and an open panel session on Tuesday afternoon. So if you Google the CRADLE Symposium and Eventbrite, the links should pop up. Thanks all for your contributions and discussion. I think it's been really great. We're going to save the chat and a recording will be available as well. So yeah, thank you so much and have a great day, evening, whatever it is where you are in the world. So thanks, Jan.